The scent of Elmonstentid Polish and ambition hung heavy in the air on the 10th floor of Poseidon Maritime. I moved with a practiced rhythm, and my reflection a fleeting ghost in the glass panes that overlooked the sprawling port of Piraeus, a chaotic dance of cranes and container ships under the relentless Attic sun. There was a spark in my eyes, one that had nothing to do with a well-polished surface. It was the glint of a mind that didn't just clean but observed, calculated, and connected the dots. The problem was, in this world of crisp suits and booming voices, no one ever looked closely enough to see it. For them, even for Stefanos Marinakos, the titan who owned this empire, I was just Eleni, the cleaning lady. I existed only in the presence of a full wastebasket or a coffee standy floor. He stormed past me just then, a whirlwind of expensive cologne and raw impatience, his mobile phone pressed to his ear like a vital organ as he barked orders about tonnage and docking fees. He clutched a leather folder stuffed with documents, his knuckles white. I watched him go, and my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. And my work uniform was a shapeless grey tunic, functional and drab, but underneath, I wore a thin silver chain with a small matty, an evil eye charm my grandmother gave me. It rested in the hollow of my throat, a cool, secret gate against my skin, a silent prayer for protection in a place that offered none. I wiped my damp hands on my apron, took a deep breath that tasted of chemical cleaners and carriage, and decided to act. I caught up to him just as he was about to enter his private office. I told him, and my voice quieter than I had intended, that I was sorry to interrupt, Kyrios Stefanou, but I had been cleaning the boardroom late last night. I explained that I shouldn't help but see some papers left on the table, the ones about the new merger with the German shipping conglomerate. I pointed out, as cautiously as I could, that some of the figures didn't seem to align. I mentioned that a particular clause in the acquiring group's contract, buried deep in the legalese, couldn't seriously compromise his controlling stake in the company. He stopped dead. For the first time all day, his gaze, the color of the Aegean on a stormy day, fell on me. A slow, sarcastic smile spread across his handsome, but cruel, lips. He asked if I was serious. He chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound, and wondered aloud to his phone companion if they had hired the Oracle of Delphi to scrub their floors now, a new expert in corporate mergers. He told me, his tone dripping with a condescension that stung more than any shout, that if I was so concerned with the company's finances, I could start by reviewing the budget for cleaning supplies. Then he was gone, leaving his laughter hanging in the air like a bad smell, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him. I stood there for a few moments, and my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun streaming through the window. It wasn't the first time I tried to raise a quiet alarm, but it was the first time I had concrete proof of something rotten. I had seen the strange meetings between his partners, the subtle alterations in contract values, the hashtag changes between managers. Now, thanks to a document left carelessly open on the president's table, I was certain this merger wasn't a partnership, it was a hostile takeover disguised with smiles and handshakes. But what good was intelligence in a place where my job title was my cage? I was just the cleaning lady. I turned back to my court, grabbing the sponge with more force than necessary, the rough texture a welcome distraction. The rest of the day crawled by. Every gleaming boardroom table, every polished brass nameplate, was a reminder of my invisibility. In the small staff kitchen, I overheard one of the receptionists, a young girl with more hairspray than sense, gushing about how this merger would save the company and double everyone's bonuses. I just lowered my eyes to my lukewarm coffee, the bitterness in the cup a pale imitation of the one in my throat. Saying anything would only earn me scornful laughs or accusations of eavesdropping. When my shift finally ended, I grabbed my worn backpack, slipped out the service exit, and began a daily walk home. The Piraeus traffic was a symphony of horns and screeching tires, but I preferred walking. It was the only time I could truly think, untangling the day's knots in my mind. My neighborhood, Drapachona, was a world away from the gleaming towers of the shipping magnates. Here, the houses were small, huddled together, their balconies overflowing with basil plants and drying laundry. My mother, Morrow, was on our small veranda, as she always was, selling pistachios into a ceramic bowl while an old ribitacus song crackled from her small radio. The moment she saw me, she offered her usual greeting, her words a tired refrain. She said I had that look on my face again, the one that said I wanted to change the world. She reminded me, as she always did, that cleaning was a blessing. I had a job, I had my health, and I had a roof over my head. That was more than most people had, she insisted. I forced a smile as I unlocked the door. I knew she was right, in her own way, but I told her that knowing you could do more, and not even trying, felt like drowning. Morrow rose slowly, her joints complaining, and gripped my arm. Her hand was small but her grip was still, forged from a lifetime of hard work. She told me that what was drowning her was watching me kill myself, over something that wasn't mine. She said I wasn't one of them, not the kind of person they would ever listen to or respect. Her advice was always the same, accept my place, live in peace. It's what she did, and look at her, alive, with her small pension and no major heartaches. I just nodded and went inside. The apartment was tiny, the furniture sparse but immaculately clean. A faded photograph of a young Morrow, wearing a learner's uniform identical to mine, hung on the living room wall. It was the only memento of the life Cindy had before retirement, a life she saw as a victory of survival, not a story of unfulfilled potential. I went straight to my room, changed out of my work clothes into a simple cotton dress, and sat at my small desk. It was covered in notebooks and printouts. I had books on maritime law, the financial market, and sheets filled with graphs and my own handwritten notes. I wasn't a formal student, but I devoured knowledge with a hunger that my daily life could never satisfy. They had made a grave mistake in this contract. I whispered the words to myself, my finger tracing a single sentence on one of the pages. I knew that if I just had the chance to present this, to show it to someone with a clear head, I could not only save the company but prove my own worth, once and for all. But the only person who could grant me that chance would laugh before I even opened my mouth. Later, from her bed, a Morrow's voice drifted through the thin wall. She asked me to promise her I wouldn't get into trouble, that these things weren't for people like us. I stared at the incriminating document under the dim light of my desk lamp. I told her that staying silent never helped anyone either, Mama. A heavy quiet settled over the little apartment, broken only by the distant rumble of a ferry and the creaking of the old building. I switched on my small lamp and continued to make notes, to highlight, to compare. I knew I was close to something big. I just didn't know yet what it would cost me to be heard. The next morning, the air in the Poseidon Maritime building was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the impending heatwave. The usual parade of crisp Italian suits was replaced by the somber black of unfamiliar lawyers, their faces grim and their briefcases looking like lead gates. Extra security guards, men with thick necks and watchful eyes that missed nothing, stood by the main elevators. Even from my corner on the 10th floor, polishing the brass railing until it gleamed, I could feel the shift. The empire was under siege. Stefanos arrived shortly after 8, striding through the lobby with the same unshakable confidence he wore every day. His navy blue suit was flawless, his silver cufflinks catching the light, his hair perfectly styled. He was the personification of control. But as he approached the boardroom, he saw the cold, impassive faces of the new arrivals, and the averted gazes of his own board members. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. His closest partner, a man named Nikos, whom I'd often seen sharing a laugh and a cigar with him, was standing with the German lawyers. As Stefanos moved towards the boardroom door, Nikos stepped forward, physically blocking his path. He told Stefanos, his voice calm and utterly devoid of friendship, that he shouldn't go in. The control of the company had been transferred in the early hours of the morning. There had been an extraordinary assembly. The merger, Nikos explained, was complete, and the new documents had been filed. Stefanos reacted with pure disbelief, his voice rising. He called it an absurdity, reminding them that he was the founder, that the merger had conditional clauses. He insisted that it had no legal standing. But the lawyers for the rival group were prepared. They stepped forward and handed him a notification. The terms had been legally circumvented, using loopholes he had completely ignored, the very ones I had tried to warn him about. Later that day, I sat beside my mother in our small living room, ate a full cup of bitter Greek coffee in my hands, watching the drama unfold on the midday news. The reporter spoke in grave tones about the collapse of the shipping giant, the sudden change of command, and the brutal devaluation of its shares on the Athens Stock Exchange. They showed uncut footage of Stefanos, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, trying to force his way back into his own boardroom. I whispered to the screen that I had tried to warn him. Morrow shook her head, her expression a mixture of pity and frustration. She said that whether I warned him or not changed nothing. This had nothing to do with me. I should leave it to the lawyers, she insisted, telling me not to get involved with those sharks. They would only devour each other. On the television, Stefanos, now sworn to beway journalists outside the building, tried to maintain his composure. A reporter shouted, asking if it was true he lost control of his company. Another voice, more incisive, questioned how he could have missed the manipulation in the merger documents. He didn't answer. He just pushed his way through the crowd towards his car, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a desperation he was failing to conceal. He slammed the car door shut and sped away, with no destination in mind. I shouldn't finish my coffee. I went to my room and closed the door gently, not wanting to alarm my mother. I spread all my papers across my small bed, the draft clauses, the handwritten observations, the highlighted fragments of contracts I'd rescued from the bin or glimpsed during my late-night cleaning. It all made a terrifying kind of sense now. This wasn't just a poorly planned merger, it was a meticulously crafted legal trap. The signatures were out of order, the dates had gaps, and there were additional pages that hadn't existed in the previous drafts. I murmured to myself that they had done this under the table. He hadn't seen it. He thought he knew everything, and now he was out on the street. My eyes landed on a specific detail I'd noted, a discrepancy between the contract number filed for the merger and the official registry at the Hellenic Chamber of Shipping. I said it aloud, the conviction solidifying in my chest, that this wasn't just negligence, it was fraud. Outside, Morrow called from the hallway that she was making lunch early. I answered that it was fine, my eyes still scanning the documents. I sat at my desk, took a blue pen, and began to map out a logical sequence of the irregularities. If I presented this the right way, perhaps I could prove the entire operation was illegal. But I didn't know how, or to whom. My only certainty was that Stefanos was completely defeated, and if anyone could still do something, it was me. Morrow appeared in my doorway, her arms crossed, her disapproval a silent hate in the room. She asked if I was getting involved in that business again. I didn't look up from my work. I told her I was in a loophole, Mama, something nobody else saw. She stepped into the room, her voice firm. She reminded me I wasn't a lawyer, a lady, nor a businesswoman. I was a cleaner. This could get me into serious trouble. I should let those people sort themselves out. They weren't like you. I stood up and began to organize the papers, carefully folding each sheet and placing them all into a simple cardboard folder. With all due respect, Mama, I said, if I know something and I stay quiet, I'll carry that with me forever. I know I don't have a degree or influence, but I have information. And if it's for nothing else, at least I tried. This time, I am not just going to clean up what others have dropped. I am going to try to stop them from knocking it all down. Moro sighed, clutching her dish towel, and looked away. She just asked me to be home before dark, please, before turning and leaving in silence. I finished securing the folder with a rubber band and placed it inside a large brown envelope. I put on the same simple clothes I wore to work, worn-out trainers, and grabbed my bag. I passed through the kitchen, took a sip of water, and glanced at my mother, who was sitting at the table, slowly stirring a pot of lentils. I told her I'd be back later, trying to avoid any more questions. She didn't reply, just nodded, like someone who understands that sometimes there is no point in trying to hold back a person who has decided to move. I left the apartment and walked towards the bus stop, the folder that could change everything clutched in my hands, and a heavy doubt in my heart about where on earth I would find someone willing to listen. The week that followed Stefanos' downfall was brutal. In a matter of days, his entire world collapsed. His imported sports car was repossessed. His penthouse apartment in Glyfada, overlooking the Saronic Gulf, was seized by a court order. His credit cards were blocked, his bank accounts frozen. Former colleagues stopped answering his calls. He was left with the streets, worn-out leather shoes, a wrinkled suit, and the shattered pride that still refused to admit utter failure. By the sixth day, after walking for hours, he ended up in a small square in the center of Athens. He was too exhausted to go on. He sat on a wooden bench, his elbows on his knees, and stared at his dirty hands. I built all of this, he muttered to himself, his voice a hoarse whisper. And my name was on the building. I ruled this market. He was trying to keep some sense of importance alive, but reality was crushing him. With an empty stomach and burning eyes, he used the last few coins in his pocket to buy a small bottle of cheap, fiery Sapporo from a corner kiosk. He came back to the bench and drank until his vision blurred and his legs felt too heavy to move. When a light rain began to fall, he didn't even bother to seek shelter. He just pulled some abandoned newspapers over himself. It's just for tonight, he repeated, as the damp chill of the morning began to seep into his clothes. The city moved on around him, an indifferent beast. He was just one more shadow on a bench. Invisible. The following morning, I was crossing that same square, my steps firm, my mind racing. I was on my way to a law office, a long shot I'd found, hoping someone would look at the documents I'd assembled. And then I saw him. I stopped dead. I recognized the man handled on. Hours had passed since that confrontation in the square. The sun was high and hot, making the asphalt of Drepachona simmer. I was sitting at our small kitchen table, sharing a simple lunch of bread, olives, and feta with my mother when the doorbell rang. It was a jarring sound in our quiet building. We rarely had visitors, especially not in the middle of the day. I opened the door and my breath caught in my throat. Stefanos stood there. He still looked like a shipwreck, his clothes rumpled and his hair unkempt, but the storm in his eyes had calmed to an uneasy stillness. And in his hands, he held the brown envelope I had dropped. He breathed deeply before speaking, his voice rough. He said I was right. He had nothing left to lose. And if what was inside that envelope was really what I claimed, then maybe it was worth a try. I was silent for a long moment, studying him, trying to decide if this was the same man who had torn my papers to pieces just hours earlier. I asked him, without irony, just with a stark firmness, if it had finally occurred to him that listening to a cleaner might not be the end of the world. He lowered his gaze, a flicker of his old pride warring with his new humiliation, and answered quietly that what had occurred to him was that continuing as he was the truth of the world. He said he didn't come to beg, he had come to accept my proposal. I made him wait at the door while I went back inside. I gathered the rest of my documents and organized them on the table. My mother, who had been listening from the hallway, appeared like a fury, her face tight with alarm. She asked if I was mad. This man, she hissed, had embarrassed me for years, humiliated me in front of everyone at that company. Now he shows up here, dirty and bankrupt, and I wanted to listen to what he had to say? I didn't raise my voice, but my response was unbending. I told her I knew what I was doing. I opening my home to him, I was offering an opportunity. And it came with rules. I turned back to Stefanos, who was still waiting in the doorway like a stray dog, and gestured for him to come in. He entered with slow, hesitant steps, as unsure he belonged in such a humble space. He sat at the table and placed the envelope next to my papers. I told him we would get straight to the point, pulling up a chair to sit directly opposite him. If he wanted to proceed with me, he had to accept 3 conditions. The first, I said, looking him dead in the eye, was that he would acknowledge my abilities and respect me as an equal. The second was that I would lead the process. I would build the strategy, I would present the evidence, I would define the path forward. The third, and I leaned slightly for this one, was that if this worked, he would not only split the profits with me but would also allocate a significant portion to fund social projects. And not for good press, I added, but to give back to those who, like me, were never given a voice. He was silent for a few seconds. I could see him calculating the risks, the way he must have done in his meetings. He was used to being in charge, to imposing his will, to never sitting ground. But he no longer had a boardroom, or a team, or anything at all. In front of him was someone who had information, courage, and the plan he had arrogantly dismissed. He asked, trying to mask his discomfort, if I was proposing to be the majority partner, to lead everything, and to direct a portion of the profits, while he just brought his name and the company's history to the table. I didn't look away. I told him he would bring the one part that only he had, but that I would be the one to rebuild this. If he didn't accept, the door was the same one he came in through. He took a deep breath, still trying to cling to some semblance of his former authority. He said he accepted, but I didn't expect him to become a different person overnight. I replied without hesitation that I didn't expect him to change, I expected him to understand. Hearing this, Moro stepped forward, even more indignant. She didn't believe I was bringing this man back into my life. She warned me he could bring me down again, that people like him don't change just because they've fallen. If he left and came up with another plan tomorrow, I'd be left looking like a fool. I looked at my mother, my expression firm. I told her I wouldn't do this for him, Mama. I was doing it for me. Because I know what I know, and I know what I can do with it. Moro crossed her arms and left the room without another word, her distrust radiating from her. In the days that followed, my small apartment transformed into a war room. We started with the records of the old merger. We went to the lawyer's office where the paperwork had been filed and confirmed that the dates had been altered, that they didn't match the company's internal archives. An accountant friend of mine, a hired man named Ένας, analyzed the financial records and confirmed that there had indeed been balance sheet manipulation. Stefanos, though clearly ashamed, began to understand just how naive he had been, and how prepared I was. He asked me one afternoon, as we were poring over documents together, how I had all of this while working as a cleaner. I had never spoken to anyone else besides him. I told him, without any resentment in my voice, that it was because nobody listens, and when they do, they laugh, just like he did. But it didn't matter now. What mattered was what we were going to do with it. At a small office in Exorkaya, we presented the initial documents. The lawyer, an older man with kind but sharp eyes, read everything with intense focus and confirmed we had grounds for legal action. He said if those signatures were indeed forged or made without the board's consent, we had a strong case, but we would have to prove every single line and we would face fierce resistance. Stefanos looked at me and told the lawyer that I had prepared every line. He just needed to follow my lead. The lawyer gave a slight, surprised laugh at the role reversal. He agreed to move forward, but warned us to be prepared. The people we were up against were professionals at making wrong look right. Meanwhile, Back at my apartment, the cohabitation with Stefanos was causing friction. Morrow grew more irritated by his constant presence. One evening, seeing him sitting in our living room reading one of the folders of old reports, she approached him and spoke without preamble. She told him he could fake humility now, but she knew his type. When he got his money back, he would forget the way to this house. He didn't think he was fooling her. Stefanos calmly closed the folder and responded, his voice low and measured. He said she was right to distrust him. He had been the kind of man who only respected those in suits, and even then, he had disrespected many. But today, he no longer respected what a person wore. He respected what they could do. And my daughter, he said, looking towards my room, could do more than any executive he had ever hired. Morrow didn't reply, just retreated, closing her bedroom door with a soft click. I observed everything, trying to stay focused on the documents. I was getting closer to piecing together the entire fraud, and despite all the tension at home, I would not back down. I knew this project was bigger than any wounded pride. It was the chance to show that intelligence and competence don't wear a uniform, and that those who underestimate someone based on their role will, sooner or later, pay the price. As I saw him helping to organize spreadsheets, I thought to myself that he still didn't understand everything we were doing, but at least he understood that now, I was in charge. He nodded without arguing. For the first time, he was listening. And for the first time, I was being heard. Over the next few days, life in my small apartment revolved around a frantic rhythm of paperwork, notarized copies, and hasty meetings with our lawyer. With meticulous attention to detail, I was charting a rigorous course for the judicial reclaim of the company shares, focusing on the fraudulent clauses and manipulated timelines we had uncovered. My days were spent hunched over the makeshift desk in the living room, cross-referencing dates with accounting logs, my highlighters blending different colors across the pages, each shade representing a potential legal vulnerability for our opponents. I found it. The minutes from a keyboard meeting mentioned a unanimous vote, but the chief financial officer's signature was missing from the document. I explained this to Stefanos one morning, my voice filled with conviction. This single omission weakened the legitimacy of the entire sales contract. Stefanos, sitting on the sofa, simply nodded, trying to keep up with the technicalities, but while I delved deeper into the legal labyrinth, Stefanos was fighting a quieter, more personal battle, adjusting to a life utterly alien to him. Breakfast was the simple affair of the old cutlery and margarine. The bed he slept on was the old single mattress my mother kept in the small storage room, a rickety thing that groaned with every movement. The sounds of the neighborhood at night, barking dogs, children playing football in the street, radios blasting echo music from open windows, were a constant disruption to his sleep. Everything about this place seemed uncomfortable and chaotic, a stark contrast to the opulent, ordered world he was used to. One day, irritated by the street noise and the simple flavor of the feijoada ID made for dinner, Stefanos lost his patience. He snapped that this wasn't a life, that I didn't understand the responsibility of running an empire. While he was managing multi-million euro contracts, I was scrubbing floors. And now I thought I could tell him what to do in a house that looked like a storage shed. I stopped writing and looked at him, my voice dangerously calm. I asked if he thought running an empire was more difficult than living with very little. Did he truly believe that being respected for wearing a suit was worth more than being ignored even when you were right? I reminded him that I hadn't asked him to come here. He had accepted because he was at rock bottom. Now, if he wanted to stay, he needed to lower his tone and behave like someone who needed to learn. Before he could retort, my mother, who had overheard the argument from the hallway, stormed into the room, her face a thundercloud. She warned him that if he ever raised his voice to her daughter under her roof again, he would be out on the street that very moment. She may not have commanded his respect before, and she certainly didn't now. He may have fallen from a great height, she sighed, but this was not the place where he would step on anyone again. Stefanos lowered his head, defeated by his own outburst. He wasn't used to being confronted, especially not by two women he had spent a lifetime underestimating. That same night, I returned to my work on the documents. While reviewing a copy of the sale contract, I noticed something I had missed before. The signature of one of the founding partners, the one who had supposedly authorized the merger, looked subtly different from his signature on other documents he had signed months earlier. I compared it with old annual reports and internal memos. The difference was slight, but it was there. And my heart began to race. I whispered to myself that this wasn't signed by him. Someone had forged this signature. I immediately separated the papers and started compiling a list of documents that could serve as a reference. With this, I could request a forensic handwriting analysis to prove the forgery and legally invalidate the sale. This was the final piece, the keystone that would make our case unshakable. Now we have our strongest point, I concluded. If this signature falls, the whole deal falls. While I worked in silence, Stefanos, still ashamed of his earlier outburst, was looking for a way to show he was trying to change. He walked into the kitchen and began to wash the accumulated dinner dishes. It was a simple task, but for him, a man who had likely never washed a dish in his life, it was a monumental act. He placed the plates in the sink, turned on the TV, and scrubbed each one carefully, as if trying to wash away the guilt of his words. He didn't complain, didn't make a sound, he just did the work. From the hallway, Moro watched him through a crack in the door. She said nothing, but in that small gesture, she saw a genuine attempt at atonement. For the first time, Stefanos had bowed his head, not out of necessity, but out of regret. She closed her door softly and returned to her room in silence. I, still in the living room, finished organizing the papers with my new discovery and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. Seeing Stefanos there, drying the plates with an old dish towel, I paused. He noticed me and said, without turning around, that he didn't know how we did this every day, but he thought he was starting to understand how much it costs to keep things running. I walked closer, jotting my glass, and replied matter-of-a-fact way, it doesn't cost so much when you know what you're building. Then I returned to my room to continue my mission. The process was in motion. The evidence was piling up, but what was truly accumulating in that tiny apartment was the slow, painful breakdown of old patterns. And although my mother was still reluctant to accept the presence of that man in her house, she was beginning to see that perhaps her daughter was right to persist. Perhaps he wasn't just a defeated man trying to get back on his feet, but someone who was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to understand what truly holds value inside a home. The next morning, before the coffee and wake-up had even cooled, the call came. It was our lawyer, her voice short and businesslike. The emergency injunction had been granted. A portion of the shares, previously locked away by the illegal maneuvers, were now frozen by court order. It was a crucial victory, preventing any further suspicious transfers and buying us the time we desperately needed. I stood motionless for a moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, and eyes fixed on the cracked plaster of the living room wall as I processed the news. Stefanos, who had been listening from the sofa, approached cautiously. He asked if it was what it sounded like, his voice a hushed whisper. I nodded, a wave of relief washing over me. We had stopped them. For now, the shares shouldn't be touched. It gave us time, and right now, time was worth more than gold. We looked at each other, not smiling, but sharing a moment of controlled satisfaction. For the first time, we weren't just reacting to the chaos, we were starting to dictate the rhythm, but our lawyer had more news. She needed us at her office that same day. The case was moving to a public hearing for a preliminary evaluation. This meant a formal presentation of our arguments, a direct address to the court. The seasoned lawyer was blunt. She said I had to be the one to speak. And the record was clean, I knew every line of the case, and I had the kind of profile the judge would want to see. She looked from me to Stefanos and said, do you want to win? They use her credibility. Stephanos bristled immediately. He declared he would not be a supporting actor in his own story. The company bore his name, his history, his losses. He was the most appropriate voice for this. I tried to explain calmly that I wasn't about erasing his history, it was about understanding what would work. The judge wanted facts, not an emotional speech. And we both knew that when he felt pressured, his arrogance took over. Would you really risk that now? He crossed his arms, his jaw tight. He accused me of taking over, of pushing him aside, of assuming I knew more than him. I sighed, but my voice was firm when I replied. It's not about knowing more. It's about doing what needs to be done. You had your chance, and you lost. Now, it's my turn. The next morning, we went to the courthouse. The tension between us was a palpable thin. When we entered the gating area, the silence grew even heavier. The lawyer briefed me on the protocol, the time limits, and pleaded with Stephanos not to interfere. He nodded, but his eyes held no conviction. When an assistant called my name, I stood up, adjusted the folder in my hands, and walked with steady steps toward the hearing room. Stephanos remained seated, but the look on his face told me his mind was a battlefield. 20 minutes later, when I came out, he was gone. I searched the corridors and found him around a corner, slumped against a wall, his face buried in his hands. I approached slowly and asked what had happened. He hesitated, his voice choked when he finally spoke. He told me they had ridiculed him. The opposing lawyers, in the hallway. They said he lost the company because he was arrogant, that he was using me to salvage his image, that he was just a failed businessman trying to manipulate an ambitious woman. He said he had wanted to answer, but when he opened his mouth, the words just stuck in his throat. And they had laughed. They laughed as if he were an immature boy playing at being a man. I felt the weight of his words. I had never seen Stephanos break down so completely, so honestly. I knelt beside him and took his hand, and my grip firm. I told him that now it was my turn to lead, and I wouldn't let them laugh at him again. But he needed to accept that sometimes, leading means staying silent so that someone else can speak for you. Later that evening, back at home, Moro was waiting in the living room, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. I sat on the sofa and told her everything, the partial victory, the hearing, and the moment I saw Stephanos confronted with the same cruelty he had once wielded against others. And my mother listened intently, and for the first time, she didn't argue. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. I had dreams too, you know, she said, her voice soft. When I was young, I wanted to open a dress shop. I made my own designs, I cut patterns from cardboard, I saved scraps of fabric. But then your grandfather got sick, your grandmother had to take over the house, and I went to work. Cleaning was what was available. And after you were born, I never thought about sewing again. I was taught to accept what you could have, not what you wanted. I remained silent, absorbing every word. Moro continued, I was just afraid. Afraid to dream and lose everything. So when I saw you wanting more, our first reaction would to pull you back, because it felt safer. But today, watching you do what you're doing, I see that maybe I should have tried, even if it meant failing. And you didn't just try. You lifted up the very person who knocked you down. We hugged then, a long, quiet embrace that needed no more words. In that moment, there was no blame between us, only understanding. Moro saw in me the woman she might have been. And I saw in my mother the silent strength that had held everything together for so long as night fell. I retreated to my room, and Stephanos at the living room, a glass of water in his hands, staring out the windows still trying to comprehend his new reality. The public humiliation had stunned, but what hurt more was the realization that for so many years, he had rejected the help of someone who was more than capable. For the first time, he felt a sense of pride in not being the center of every decision. He was beginning to understand that leadership wasn't about who shouted the loudest, but about who acted with truth. As he heard my bedroom door close, he murmured to himself, she knows what she is doing. And if it has to be this way, then let it be with her in charge. The battle was far from over, but something fundamental had already shifted. The way we each ourselves in this story had changed. And that, in itself, was a victory.